Hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for the Hyborian Age with a long overdue chat here from me about the Frost Giant's Daughter, Robert E. Howard's second ever written Conan adventure. And it's a very short story. It's only about 7 pages maybe, at least in the edition that I'm reading it from, and one of those 7 pages is a full-page illustration. So the whole story will take you maybe 7 or 8, 10 minutes at the most to read, and that's if you stop to look at the artwork, which of course I love to do, and we'll chat about that as well. But as short of a story as it is, I've got a little bit of a longer story just to explain a little background to this video here. I meant to do this originally 2 years ago as an offering for Michael K. Vaughan's Cimmerian September, which he started 2 years ago, I think. So this September here was the third and now annual Cimmerian September. And it's geared, of course, to encourage us all to be reading Robert E. Howard Conan adventures, as well as pastiche Conan adventures written by others, or other Robert E. Howard stories, that kind of a thing. But the gist of it really is Conan himself as the nucleus for the BookTube event. And a couple of years ago, during the first year of Cimmerian September, I did a video on The Phoenix on the Sword, which was Howard's first Conan story that he wrote and got published. And I was going to do The Frost Giant's Daughter. I was just going to kind of go in the order that they were written. But I ran out of time a couple of Septembers ago. And then last year, I was going to try to do The Frost Giant's Daughter and ran out of time again for various reasons. So this year I was committed. I was going to finally get around to doing The Frost Giant's Daughter. And I thought, September was slipping away from me again, but it's such a short story that I thought, well, I could probably put the video together in a few days here. There was more artwork that I was starting to uncover and gather and collect and research and all that September was slipping away from me. And I wanted it to be part of Cimmerian September. Didn't seem right to post a Cimmerian September offering at some random time. Certainly, I don't like doing things late. So I was exchanging some email with Michael K. Vaughan, the creator of Cimmerian September, and was asking him if he'd ever considered having some kind of a mid-year Conan event to kind of bridge the gap between Septembers. And not that he doesn't already have plenty on his plate anyway, but he says, if you wanted to do a deep dive on The Frost Giant's Daughter, it's okay if it's a little late. So what? We need to keep the spirit of Cimmerian September alive throughout the year anyway. And I thought, okay, well, then in that case, I'm just going to make it easier on myself here, and I'll take a little more time and put it together. And then I started to find out just how much artwork was generated over the years, over the decades, for this one little story. And so as I was putting this together, I thought maybe, and as long as I'm taking my time here, maybe I'll do a 3-parter, and that'll take us all the way from the early years of trying to get the story published. The story was never published in Howard's lifetime, on up until when it finally was getting published, and then the Frazetta artwork, of course, I want to talk about that. And then my own inauguration to Conan was through Marvel Comics, and so the Barry Windsor-Smith comic adaptation. I wanted to cover all that. But I was finding out that, and I guess I knew this already, but I was immersing myself here in collecting the later post-Marvel Comics adaptations of Conan, and in particular Frost Giant's Daughter. And there's a lot of those, and alternative covers, and just a lot of artwork to get into. So I thought, well, maybe it'll be more than a trilogy. I really want to keep it down to, but anyway, so I was plugging away at putting this video together. And then a couple, 2-3 weeks later, Michael K. Vaughan himself did an Epic Comic Book Wednesday installment featuring the Frost Giant's Daughter, the Dark Horse adaptation. So now here was Mike himself even doing a Conan installment post Cimmerian September. So I thought, okay, well, cool. So it's keeping the Frost Giant's daughter alive in this little corner of BookTube here. But being an epic comic book Wednesday, of course, Steve Donoghue then had to respond to that with his own discourse on the Dark Horse adaptation of the Frost Giant's daughter. So, okay, well, this has given me a good kick in the pants here to get my own Frost Giant's daughter video going. And then just this last weekend, Grammatics covered the Frost Giant's daughter with a really nice video, and I'll leave a link to all these videos down below in the notes. But Grammatics did a really nice video on the Barry Windsor-Smith Marvel Comics adaptation of the Frost Giant's daughter. And it was inspired, I guess, that got him to post about it is because Stygian Dogs, who I'm not really familiar with, but Grammatics is talking about it, had just done a video on the Frost Giant's daughter, again, from the Savage Sword of Conan Reforged, where basically it's the Barry Windsor-Smith adaptation, but it's been recolorized. That's another story. We'll get into that later on. But as I was putting all these together, and all these other Frost Giant Daughters offerings were popping up all around this little corner of BookTube here, I thought I really got to get going. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep this to 3 or maybe 4 installments, but I want to be a completist on this, and I want to do a really deep dive. And so I'll just break it up into logical parts here. And I thought, if it's going to be more than 2 or 3 weeks here, maybe I'll just invent my own little BookTube event here, and I'm going to call it Frost Giant Fridays. And so my idea here is to post little installments to keep it manageable, one video every Friday here for the next few weeks. And I kind of got it sort of mapped out here. What was I going to do? So I thought that part 1, which we'll cover here today, is the early years of Howard trying to get it published, and finally when it did get published in the 50s, 30 years after he had written it, 20 years after he had written it, and then on up to the now iconic Frank Frazetta cover, which is just a brilliant and kind of the anchor of this particular video. Then the next part will be about the Marvel Comics Barry Windsor-Smith adaptation, and then part 3 will be when the story was finally unedited, published in its original form that Robert E. Howard intended it to be written in, not edited by, well, we'll get into the story here next time. And then we'll see if I can get to probably in part 4, get to the later comic adaptations, Dark Horse, Ablaze, and Titan. And then during all of these here, there's going to be other little editions of books that came up here and there that also had some pretty cool illustrations. So that's a pretty long-winded introduction here to this first video, but really to this whole endeavor here of mine. And we'll just see how long I can stretch it out or wrap it up, hopefully. But let's start off by looking at Robert E. Howard and a little bit of the background of his writing The Frost Giant's Daughter, and then we'll take it from there. Now, by the time Robert E. Howard came up with the idea for Conan as a character, he'd already been writing pulp adventures for a while now. And the idea of Conan came to him pretty fully formed, really. And when he first started writing the Conan stories, he was just writing them one after another, just an inspired creative period there of several weeks or months, and was writing stories of Conan from all different periods during Conan's lifetime, rather than writing them from the beginning to the end. And in fact, his first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, was set much later in Conan's life, where he had been king of Aquilonia for a while. And then the second story he wrote, The Frost Giant's Daughter, he was a very young man, apparently 15 or 16 years old, although it never really gives his age specifically in the story. But we are, just through a discussion of the Conan canon, understand that he was a young man early in his fighting career. So Howard was writing his stories just all out of order, kind of like the Horatio Hornblower series, where they jump around in Hornblower's career in the British Navy. But Howard, I think, in my opinion, had one of the best explanations for doing it this way. And it doesn't really need to be explained, but in his mind, he had grown up listening to adventure stories told by people that had been through things in their lifetimes, and he just loved hearing stories, being a storyteller himself. And whenever somebody was speaking of their history and stories that were worthy of being shared, they never told the stories in any kind of a chronological order. They would just tell a story. And depending on when you're talking to them or how many weeks or months or years you've known them, and you say, oh, tell me another story about your days in whatever. They would tell a story, no particular order. They wouldn't say, well, the very first thing that ever happened, and then march through their lifetime. They would tell them in little bits. And so it's a natural way, he thought, to tell the Conan stories, as though they are being reminiscences of Conan's life, not told in a chronological story or timeline, but as individual stories that each stand on their own as anecdotes. He first submitted those first two stories to Weird Tales together, Phoenix on the Sword and The Frost Giant's Daughter, sent them off to Weird Tales, and got an interesting letter back from Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales, that was accepting the submission of the Phoenix on the Sword and rejecting the Frost Giant's Daughter, which Wright did not really think was that good of a story, probably due to the explicit nature of what Conan plans to do to the Frost Giant's Daughter when he captures her. Now, it doesn't mention that specifically in the letter, as you may be able to see here, but if that is the case, it kind of makes me wonder, well, isn't it the same situation that Farnsworth Wright accepted C.L. Moore's very first story, Shambleau, which was basically the same situation fundamentally, except that the genders were reversed in that story, and maybe that was just a little more acceptable somehow. But anyway, that also is another story. But the Phoenix on the Sword was very strong, he thought, so he bought that outright. And I talked a little bit about this in my first video of the Phoenix on the Sword, this letter here, but I'll put it up here again since it does involve the Frost Giant's Daughter here. And if you want to pause the screen and actually read this combination acceptance-rejection letter, hopefully you can read that on the screen there. And as you can see, the letter from Farnsworth Wright back to Howard was dated March 10th, 1932. So that's around the time that Conan was first starting to see print. Now, Howard had been writing his Conan stories specifically to be published in Weird Tales magazine. That's where he wanted Conan to live. But here, one of his stories that he really liked, The Frost Giant's Daughter, had been rejected by Weird Tales. So what was he to do? He didn't want to offer it as a Conan story elsewhere. He didn't want to water the character down. It's going to be just exclusively a Weird Tales character. But since it was rejected, he thought he could shop it around and at least get it published somehow if he changed some of the names around and made the lead character not Conan, but just a Conan-like character. And so he sent it off with some changes, a few edits here and there, changing Conan's name to Amra of Akbatana. And he was also, Amra was a character with black hair fighting with the blonde Aenir, same tribe, north of his homeland that he had allied himself with. And the story itself, if you had not read The Frost Giant's Daughter as a Conan story, but were familiar with the Conan character, this story here, which was retitled Gods of the North, reads just like a Conan story with just some names changed. There's even a by Crom that slips in there to remind us of where Amra had come from. But he sent it off, and he got it published 2 years after he had written it in 1934 by a fan magazine called The Fantasy Fan. And no illustrations went with it. It's still just a few pages long. Most of the story is almost verbatim from what Howard had originally written as a Conan story. But it did get published, not as a Conan story, but he did get it in print, a story that he liked quite a bit. Now, almost 20 years later, in early 1934, 17 years after Howard's death, his original manuscript for The Frost Giant's Daughter resurfaced. Apparently, it was found amongst some other papers of Robert E. Howard's in an old shoebox somewhere by a literary agent that had inherited these papers from Howard's own literary agent sometime before. And these papers wound up somehow in the hands of L. Sprague de Camp, who thought he could shop these Howard stories around and make some money on it himself if he edited them a little bit and put his own mark on these stories. And so he did. He edited The Frost Giant's Daughter. Didn't really change the story, but just decided that it would be better if he went in there and reworded several passages, some longer and shorter throughout the story. Not changing the story really, but just rewording it for whatever reason, and managed to get The Frost Giant's Daughter published in Fantasy Fiction, the August 1953 issue. And so it finally saw print as a Conan story, as The Frost Giant's Daughter, 17 years after Robert E. Howard had died. Now, in October of that same year, de Camp put together a collection of Conan stories in a Gnome Press edition called The Coming of Conan. And again, with no illustrations. I'll put the cover up here so you can see it. We've got kind of a caveman version of Conan here. But The Frost Giant's Daughter does appear in that story, but still with the L. Sprague de Camp edits. And then a few years later, 1956 now, the original edited version of Gods of the North reappeared again now because Sam Moskowitz, who was a pretty well-known science fiction and fantasy historian, happened to have one of the few remaining copies of that fan magazine that Gods of the North appeared in. This otherwise probably would have disappeared. There may have not have been any copies of that left over, perhaps. But Sam Moskowitz did have a copy of it, and he offered it to Fantastic Universe for their December 1956 issue as a lost tale from Robert E. Howard, even though it's virtually the same, other than changing some names and a few words around here and there from the Frost Giant's Daughter that de Camp had edited. It was now a lost tale of Robert E. Howard. All right, now let's move up to 1974, and this is my own introduction to Conan as a character through Marvel Comics. We'll get into the Marvel Comics adaptation in the next video in part 2. But for now, I want to end this video by talking about the that fantastic Frank Frazetta cover that is just so iconic now, and probably if anyone knows of a single illustration for The Frost Giant's Daughter, it's probably this particular cover. But in 1974, just to back up a little bit, early 74, I was in college by then. I had quit collecting comic books. I was a big Marvel guy in junior high school, and kind of fell out of it during my high school years. Wasn't reading or collecting or buying comics for a few years there. But when I got into college, a college pal of mine, who I had known from since high school, was still buying and reading comic books. And one day at lunchtime, we left the campus to go get something to eat, and we stopped off at a liquor store not too far from school. And there was a spinner rack of comic books in there, and he started pulling comics out of that rack one after another and just building up a stack he was going to buy. And as I was watching that spinner rack spin around, I was remembering how much I liked Marvel comics several years earlier, and how before that I was a big DC, Superman, Batman fan, and I saw Batman Annual, with the new Batman Annual, whichever issue that was in early 1974, caught my eye, and I pulled it out of the rack, and I'm flipping through, and I go, this looks pretty good. This is some later stories than I was familiar with. There were new artists, and it kind of caught my attention. All right, so I held on to that comic and then pulled a Superman comic out of there. And all right, I had a handful of comics at that point, and went up to the cash register and realized, okay, I may be back into reading comics again. So this friend of mine, Jim, good buddy of mine back then, he knew of this comic book store and science fiction bookstore in Long Beach called Wonderworld Books, kind of a renowned bookstore, long gone now. But he knew of this place in Long Beach. So instead of going back to class, we got back in the car and we drove out to Long Beach and went in, and they had every comic book that was being published at the time, as well as racks and racks of paperbacks, hardbacks, of any kind of science fiction that was current at the time, fantasy, science fiction books, fan magazines, you name it. It really was Wonderworld Books. And I just started at one end of that comic rack and started to pull out all the titles that I had been familiar with before, and walked out of there probably spending, geez, what was it back then? I bet $8 or $9 worth of comics in a giant stack like this, as prices were back then. They also sold these paperbacks, as I was saying. And about that time, Sphere Books, the UK line of books, had just been republishing the Lancer books that had come out some years earlier that I was unfamiliar with. All the whole Conan series, edited by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. And I was an art student at the time, so I was looking for... I would buy a lot of science fiction and fantasy books, whether I was going to read them or not, because the covers were so great. And, of course, the Frank Frazetta covers here were just fantastic. So I think I scooped all of them up at once. I may have bought a few this week and a few the following week when I went back, but I wound up with this collection of the Sphere editions that had used the same cover art as the Lancer editions some years before. Now, not all of these covers were by Frank Frazetta. There were a couple in there by other artists, but most of them were by Frank Frazetta. And as far as I can remember, I believe this was probably my first formal introduction to Frank Frazetta. Now, as an art student, I think that I had seen some of Frazetta's work here and there for whatever reason, just influences and things that art students would share and talk about amongst each other. But now I had some context to who Frank Frazetta was and who this character Conan was now, because of reconnecting with comic books. It was the Marvel comics that really introduced me to Conan as a character, and understanding that it was based on these stories and books by Robert E. Howard, who I was not familiar with either. So this collection of paperbacks here was my first awareness of the Howard, DeCamp, and Carter universe of Conan's stories. But now let's talk about that great Frank Frazetta illustration, which was on the cover of the Lancer Books edition of Conan of Cimmeria, which first appeared in the United States in 1969, a few years before I was aware of the Sphere editions. And these reprint the rewritten and edited, and many would say contaminated, Conan saga stories by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. Frazetta titled this painting of his Snow Giants, and he painted it in oil on a piece of 15 by 21 Academy board. Now, when Frazetta got the commission to paint all these covers, he had not read Conan. He wasn't a big reader and was not familiar with the character of Conan. But he had a good friend, Roy Krenkel, who himself was a great illustrator of science fiction and fantasy. And I know Krenkel's work mostly from his covers for early Edgar Rice Burroughs paperbacks from the 50s and 60s. So Krenkel and Frazetta were pals, and Krenkel had read the Conan stories, was familiar with them, and he talked to Lancer Books and found out which stories were going to be in these Conan paperbacks, and then he offered suggestions to Frazetta of certain scenes that he thought might be good cover illustrations for the books that those particular stories were going to appear in. So he described the scene to Frazetta of the battle between Conan and the Frost Giant's daughter's two brothers, a very significant scene in the story. Krenkel didn't feel, once he saw the finished Snow Giants painting by Frazetta, that the Snow Giants were not giant enough. But I guess that will depend on any individual's particular reading of the story. The story itself does not say how giant they were, just that they were giant. Now, speaking of the description in the story, and I always want to look at illustrations with an eye towards how much of the author's actual descriptions does the illustrator get right or choose to overlook for whatever reason. But one of the things that I noticed that is missing in, well, a couple of things, but the first thing I'll mention is that Howard's description of the snow giants is that their beards are hanging with ice and icicles, so they're looking very frozen and creatures of the snow. One of the things that is incorrect is that Conan is holding up his shield here to protect himself, and we are told by Howard at the very beginning of the story that Conan and Heimdall had both lost their shields when they were fighting each other in the very opening page of the story. So Conan should not have a shield. I suppose you might say that somewhere between the very beginning of the story and at this point he picked up one of the fallen warriors' shields and had that with him. But reading the story carefully, it never really mentions anything like that. As soon as he has slain Heimdall at the beginning of the story, the Frost Giant's daughter appears and then leads him on a merry chase. And that's what brings him to her brothers here that he's fighting in this painting here. So there really shouldn't be a shield, but it's Frank Frazetta, so I think we're going to forgive him for that. But for me, the biggest omission or oversight here, and maybe it was from Krenkel's description, don't know, but Frazetta does not show us the Snow Giant's daughter herself. Wouldn't this, I think the only thing that could make this painting better would be if it had the Snow Giant's daughter, Atali, in there. Wouldn't that have been great to see a Frazetta girl figured into this composition here somehow? Now, I believe that it was Frank Frazetta who first established the big muscle-bound version of Conan as a character. He's not really described as being overly muscle-bound in the actual Howard stories necessarily. And the illustrations up until Frazetta were of Conan as a very fit fellow, certainly, but not the overly exaggerated musculature and all that, which Frazetta had already been doing with his artwork, just his style up until now anyway. But ever since, it has been embraced by fan and illustrator alike on up to the current day. I don't think you will ever see another rendition of Conan where he's a little more lightweight. Now, I guess you could make a case for a Barry Windsor-Smith's version where he was more of a slender fellow. He's still very muscular, but he wasn't the big Frazetta John Buscema style muscle man as we have become used to now. But we'll get into that more in part 2, where we talk about the Marvel adaptations by Barry Windsor-Smith. Now, one of Frazetta's influences had been Hal Foster and his comic strip Prince Valiant, and that's where he got the idea for the horned helmets that his barbarians and Vikings would often wear in the Frazetta paintings. Vikings themselves did not actually wear horned helmets. That was more of an invention for the Wagnerian operas. So that became an influence for people like Frazetta and Hal Foster and Jack Kirby when he was illustrating the Mighty Thor comics back in the 1960s. So that's why today we all think of Vikings with the horned helmets. None of us really remember what kind of cowboy hats or baseball caps Vikings actually wore into battle. And we'd probably be surprised to see how they really dressed. But anyway, there you have it, folks. That will wrap up part 1 here. And I hope you enjoyed it. These are a lot of fun to make here. I'm going to keep going here. So part 2 will be up, I hope, next Friday. And we'll talk about the Marvel Barry Windsor-Smith comic book adaptation of The Frost Giant's Daughter. So until then, we'll hopefully talk to you soon, and thanks a lot.